Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five is a story about a man who becomes unstuck in time. He lives through his whole life over and over again with no rhyme or reason to how and when he experiences his life, if that even makes sense. The main character, Billy Pilgrim, knows everything about his life, before and after they happen, including his death. With this in mind, there are many subtleties in the story. There aren't any major conflicts. Yes, there are major events, but how can it be determined as a major conflict if everything has already happened and is happening at the same time? One thing that could be considered as the major conflict could be when he gets in a crash, which spiraled everything down into what is determined as time travel. The only problem with this is that this is near the start of the story and isn't presented as a profound event. As confusing as that is, the other characters in the story don't have an idea of what's going on with Billy Pilgrim. I wouldn't consider any character besides Billy as a main character, rather than just side characters that occupy space in a given scene or time period within the book. There isn't much emphasis on the characters themselves, more of their actions during the time period. I believe that anyone in the story could have done anything that someone else did, and it would all end up the same way. This can also prompt the question that many people, including me, have pondered after finishing the story. Is Billy Pilgrim actually time traveling, or is he just going insane? There can be different sides to this, as there's enough evidence to prove both, but not enough to decree one as the truth. My overall thoughts about this book and how it presents its ideas are that I think they're very interesting to think about. I think that the premise of the story is unique, and the way that Vonnegut portrays it is eccentric. Although sometimes throughout the book, when Vonnegut changes time periods or when Billy time travels, Vonnegut doesn't directly show that the time period has changed. I lose track of it and don't realize that the point of view has changed, and I can get lost in the story a lot. Another difficulty I had while reading is that there isn't really a sense of direction where the story is going. I think that if the time traveling had a little more of a path that it's trying to follow, it could be understood easier and could be implemented in the story a little better, instead of it being completely random. He has seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all the events in between, he says. This example just shows that there isn't any rhyme or reason to the time traveling. It is very much random, as it says in the quote, and has no correlation to the story, where it could have played a much bigger part in the ensemble of the story. One other thing that is present throughout the whole story is that it is very vague, and it forces the readers to determine a lot of the story by themselves with no assistance. It even references multiple times in this story the phrase of "puti wheat." This is placed at the very end of the story, presenting a very indistinct finish to the story, not really giving any explanation to it or what it could mean. There is also a lot of potentially offensive content within the story. There's lots of swear words, some mature scenes, and also violent death threats throughout the book. As much as there is what I would call bad aspects of the book, there are also very many pros. The situations that Billy gets himself into are very interesting to try and interpret. One of the biggest moral bombshells was handed to Billy by the Tralfamadorians. The Tralfamadorians are a colony of aliens that abducted Billy to be in one of their intergalactic zoos. This species speak and think in many different ways that humans do. It is interesting to try and infer to how Billy will react, what he will think about this moral bombshell, and what he will do in the future with his knowledge. Not only that, but as much as I've disagreed with how it is very confusing to try and follow all the way through, this leaves the reader with a lot to think about, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can give them different insight into how they like to think about things, or they can form their own conclusion how they like, which can satisfy many different types of readers. One last thing that I enjoy about this is that it doesn't only have one setting. It has various different ones that counteract one another. On one side of the spectrum, it presents the simplicity of past history, while on the other side, it presents the modernity of the different civilizations. If I hadn't spent so much time studying Earthlings, said the Tralfamadorian, I wouldn't have any idea what was meant by free will. I've visited 31 inhabited planets in the universe, and I've studied reports on 100 more. Only on Earth is there any talk of free will. This shows what I think is the most interesting part of this book, the different thought processes and perspectives that the Tralfamadorians have. It gives a different view on life itself, and could change someone's life if interpreted the right way. Overall, I think that this book is as interesting as science fiction can get, with many different premises given and a lot to think about as the story comes to a conclusion. As much as I enjoyed reading Slaughterhouse-Five, many other critics didn't. A review written by Jonathan Creasy on March 5th, 2015 proves this. The main point that Creasy makes isn't really targeted at the story, but is targeted at the facts at the book. I don't think that this book was made to follow the history of the past exactly, scene by scene. Creasy's argument doesn't really prove valid, as this is considered a science fiction novel, which means that it isn't true, and information given in the story doesn't have to match up exactly with what actually happened in real life. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write about the destruction of Dresden, and I thought, too, that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big. He brings up that he could have written a book about what happened in Dresden and probably made a lot of money from it, but he didn't. It almost feels as if Creasy is jealous of Vonnegut for stealing his idea in a way, and profited from that. The problem with this point is that Vonnegut's book wasn't about the history, but it was about the time traveling, the moral ideas, different points of views on life, and so on. Billy could have been placed in any other different situation. I think that the book still would have been as successful as it is today. Creasy's review almost seems like he needed to rant about how he could have made a lot of money from making a book about Dresden, but needed other things to cover it up so he didn't sound like so much of a tool. I don't think that Creasy got the point of the story, and it leads me to feel like this is a misleading and not a very credible review. I personally think that this is a very good book to read as a pastime, and leaves the reader with a lot to think about. I would recommend it for any science fiction book lovers. I would also rate this book 4 out of 5 stars because as much as I enjoyed the story, I don't think it'd be suitable for all types of people.